Hey everyone, welcome back to Bible class. Today we're going to be taking a look at the importance of the nation of Israel and how throughout history their very existence has been threatened, but also how the fact that they still remain is a living testimony to the God who chose them from among the nations. Mark Twain famously said concerning the Jews, "If the statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1/4% of the human race. It suggests a nebulous puff of stardust lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, the Jews ought hardly to be heard of. But he is heard of, has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contributions to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and abstruse learning are very out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. He has made a marvelous fight in this world in all ages, and he has done it with his hands tied behind him. He could be vain of himself and be excused for it. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, and the Persians rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greeks and Romans followed and made a vast noise, and they were gone. Other people have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out, and they sit in twilight now and have vanished. The Jew saw them all, survived them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert but aggressive mind. All things are mortal but the Jews. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality?" Now, Mark Twain said that in September of 1897. Now, that's some 40 years before the Holocaust and more modern persecutions of the Jewish people. But his question remains, what is the secret to his immortality? You see, if you look throughout history, it seems that in every generation, the nations rise up to destroy the Jewish people. Whether it's the Egyptians or the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Persians or the Russians or the Germans, the Jews are no strangers to facing annihilation. But one thing remains constant through all the years: God's promise. God has promised that no matter what happens or happens again, he will never leave them nor forsake them. That as long as the sun shines by day and the moon and stars by night, Israel will never cease from being a nation. And God always delivers his people. Sometimes he does it by sending plagues and splitting seas, while other times he does it through seemingly ordinary circumstances. I want to look at one of those examples. So let's take a look at the Book of Esther. I love the Book of Esther. I know you're probably thinking, well, if you love it so much, why don't you marry it? Well, I did. Sort of. This is my wife, Esther. I've also directed a few musicals based on the book, so yeah, you could say I love the Book of Esther. Celebrated at the Feast of Purim, the Book of Esther chronicles the rescue of the Jewish people from the plot of Haman, a high officer of the Persian Empire and advisor to King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, depending on your translation. Haman's rage was incited by a single Jew, Mordecai, who refused to bow down before him. But rather than seeking revenge against Mordecai alone, Haman plotted to annihilate the entire Jewish people. Haman gained permission from the king to do as he wished against the Jews. He legislated that all of the Jews would be killed on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar. Haman determined that day by casting lots, which is sort of like rolling dice today, just a game of chance. And that would decide what day to exterminate the Jews. By leaving the day entirely to chance, Haman was emphatically declaring that he believed the world worked as a result of chance and randomness, not by the plan and providence of a creator God. But what makes this story so miraculous is how unmiraculous it is. Would there be fire from heaven or a giant hand writing on the wall? Well, not this time. The Jews were certainly saved by God, there's no doubt there, but it was in a non-miraculous way. Any one of these events that just so happened could be viewed as a fortuitous coincidence, but when you string them together, they create a miraculous chain of events orchestrated by God. So here's the recap. King Ahasuerus holds a 6-month feast in the capital city of Susa. And it just so happens that when Queen Vashti refuses to appear before the king, he has her deposed or fired. And when a nationwide beauty contest is held to find the next queen, it just so happens that Esther, a Jewish girl, is chosen to be queen. And then when some palace guards plot to assassinate the king, it just so happens that Mordecai, Esther's relative, happens to overhear the plot and foil it. One night, it just so happens that the king couldn't sleep. So he asked for someone to read to him from the royal annals. And it just so happens that they open directly to the page of Mordecai's long-forgotten act of bravery. At that very moment, Haman just so happens to approach the king, seeking permission to hang Mordecai on a gallows he had constructed. But instead, King Ahasuerus has Haman dress Mordecai in the royal robes and parade him through the streets of the capital. The heroics of Mordecai and Esther were in recognizing God's hand and taking the necessary steps, no matter how challenging they would be. When Esther fears appearing before the king uninvited, Mordecai reminds her that God promised the Jewish people would be saved one way or another. The only question is, will you rise to the challenge God has placed in front of you? You see, God was giving her the opportunity to be the instrument of his salvation. And this is where Mordecai drops the classic, "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance from the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows if perhaps you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this." At the climax of the story, Esther holds a banquet where she reveals her secret Jewish identity and exposes Haman for plotting genocide against her people. King Ahasuerus has Haman hung on the very same gallows he intended to hang Mordecai on. The king declares the Jews would defend themselves from anyone who would dare to attack them on the 13th day of that 12th month of Adar. And the Jews defeated their enemies, including Haman's 10 sons. But more on them in a minute. Mordecai and Esther enact an annual holiday of feasting and gladness and giving gifts to the poor. That feast is called Purim today, which means lots that are cast. You see, it reminds us of Haman's worldview, where everything is determined by chance, and how that was overturned by the fact that God is present and intimately involved, even if there aren't seas parting and fire falling from the sky. Interestingly enough, the Book of Esther does not mention the name of God. It's just not in there. One might even say that he's hidden in the book. But if you're willing to look, I think you'll find that he is most certainly present. But now back to Haman's 10 sons for a minute. I think there might be something hidden there in the text. This might seem like a little bit of a stretch, but remember Proverbs 25:2. It says it is the glory of God to conceal a matter, and the glory of kings to search it out. So let's take a look at Esther chapter 9. We're going to jump into the narrative right after the Jews successfully defended themselves. The Jews put all their enemies to the sword, killing and destroying them. And they did as they pleased to those who hated them in the citadel of Susa. The Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, including Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arasai, Aradai, and Vizatha. They killed these 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. So the 10 sons of Haman were killed, and then the king asks Esther what else he can do for her. On that day, the number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king, who had said to Queen Esther, "In the citadel of Susa, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, including Haman's 10 sons. What have they done in the rest of the royal provinces? Now what is your petition? It will be given to you. And what further do you request? It will be fulfilled." Now, Esther's request is quite the strange one. As Esther replied, "If it pleases the king, may the Jews in Susa also have tomorrow to carry out today's edict, and may Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows." Wait a minute. Aren't they already dead? Why would you hang someone on a gallows if they were already dead? Now, I realize you could take this in a literal way and say, well, the bodies of the 10 sons of Haman were to be hung as a sign to anyone in the future who would seek to harm the Jewish people. And I agree with that. I think that's a great interpretation. I think that's very good. But I think there may be even more happening here. Because you see, she specifically requests if they can act again tomorrow. While tomorrow might be the literal next day, I wonder if it could also mean sometime in the future. You see, with prophecy, you can interpret them to be near and far prophecies. Basically, a prophecy can be understood in the direct context in which it was given, like the days of the prophet themselves, or it could apply to some future fulfillment. The example I like to use is, when is school out? Someone might say, it's out at 2:30, and they'd be right. Someone else might come along and say, no, June 1st, and they'd be right. Then someone else might come along and say, no, it's when you graduate, and they'd also be right. You see, it all depends on how near someone is looking or how far someone is looking, with respect to time, obviously, not distance. But this same idea, I think, can be applied to Esthers Request. But first, let's take a look at the Hebrew of Esther chapter 9, verses 7 through 9. As you know, the Hebrew scrolls were very meticulously copied. And not only were the letters important, but also the spacing was important. You see, when a scribe copied a scroll, they had to make sure that every letter was in the exact same place and the exact same size as it was in the original. That's like saying the font and font size and spacing all had to be identical. It's almost like someone made a hand-copied photocopy. So when we look at these verses, they look a little strange. Now remember that Hebrew is read from right to left. So basically we have a list of the 10 sons of Haman's names with sort of an and on the other side. Like Parshandatha and this guy and the next one and so on. But a closer examination reveals a few letters that are too small. It's like they were intentionally copied in a smaller font size. And those three Hebrew letters are Tav, Shin, and Zion. It's almost like the author and the scribes wanted us to look at these three little letters and say, okay, what are they? Well, if you take those three Hebrew letters and you put them together, they spell the word Teshav. So what does that mean? Well, unfortunately, it's not a word. It's just not a Hebrew word. It's kind of like if you took three English letters and just shoved them together. It's like T, S, and Z. Like, what's that spell? Well, it's not a word. But you see, in Hebrew, the letters are also numerals. So each letter has a numeric value. The rabbis call the study of the relationship between these numeric values gematria, but that's a study for a different day. But here, these letters have a numeric value of 707. But what does 707 have to do with Esther and the 10 sons of Haman? Maybe it's a year. You see, in the Hebrew reckoning of time, which starts counting years at the creation of Adam, Hebrew scholars believe we are currently living in the year 5,781 since Adam. While there's certainly arguments around these dates, they would have been accepted in the days of Esther as well as in the days of Jesus. So when's 707? You see, when giving a date in Hebrew years, often the millennium is not given and is just understood. Sort of like if I said I was born in 85, you'd assume the 19 part of my birth year. So how can we know what millennium this 707 is pointing us to? Well, it turns out there's actually one more letter that's not the right size. There's actually a letter that's too large, and it's the Vav down here. And Vav has a numeric value of 6. So maybe it's pointing us to the 6th time that the year would be 707, which would be in the 5th millennium, or the Hebrew year 5,707. And if you convert that into our modern dating system, that would put us right in the year 1946. 1946? Isn't that shortly after the Holocaust ended? Correct, yes. But also, it was the conclusion of the Nuremberg Trials. Now, if you don't remember, these trials were where 24 of the highest-ranking Nazi officials were placed on trial for their crimes against humanity. Of those 24 officers, 12 of them were sentenced to death. But one of them sort of got off on a legal technicality, and one of them actually killed himself while he was in prison. So 10 of the highest-ranking Nazi officials were to be executed. Now, the traditional method of execution for war crimes was death by firing squad. But the judge famously said, "These men aren't worthy of bullets. Let them be hanged on a gallows." So 10 of the highest-ranking Nazi officials were to be hung in 1946, or the Hebrew year 5707. One of those men was named Julius Stryker. Now, Stryker was an anti-Semitism propagandist for the Nazis. He often used the Jewish holidays in his writings, saying things like the Jews ate the blood of Christian children for Passover, and he was particularly fond of Purim, found in the Book of Esther, where the Jews murdered all of their enemies. So, anyways, at his execution, Stryker showed no signs of remorse when he clicked his heels together and yelled, "Heil Hitler," before he ascended the gallows. And then, just before they put the hood over his face, his last words were, "Purim Fest, 1946. What? Are you serious? The guy yells out, "Purim Fest, 1946. 10 of the highest-ranking Nazi officials were to be executed in the year 1946, or the Hebrew year 5707, which seems to have been hidden within 3 little letters found within the names of the 10 sons of Haman all the way back in the days of Esther. And if you think that's unbelievable, do you want to hear something else unbelievable? This photo of the scroll with the names of the 10 sons of Haman on, I actually took that photo in the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City. This is in the Living Holocaust Memorial. I was standing there and I looked up and I saw the scroll, and it just so happens to be open to the names of the 10 sons of Haman. I was there with some students and some coworkers, and obviously I had to stop everybody and look at the 3 little letters that we could see on the scroll that was recovered from one of the camps. Now, I don't know if the curator of the museum knows about all of this or did that on purpose, but I found that deeply profound and could not believe what I was seeing when I was standing there and looking at it. Was Esther asking for this future when she said, "Let us hang the 10 sons of Haman"? I don't know. But what is sure is that God is present and intimately involved in our lives, even when there's not parting of the seas and fire falling from the sky. So to answer Mark Twain's question, what is the secret to the Jews' immortality? They live still as a constant reminder that there is a God in heaven who deeply loves his people and longs for their repentance to restore a right relationship between them. As long as the Jewish people live, we can be sure that one day the Lord himself will come down, set his feet on the Mount of Olives, and living water will flow forth from Jerusalem. On that day, the Lord will be king over the whole earth, and there will be one Lord in his name, the only name. We may forget this from time to time, but our God is a covenant-keeping God, and he does not forget. Wherever we go and whatever happens, God's unshakable promise follows us for eternity. So thanks for joining us today. I hope this was as much fun for you as it was for me, and enjoy the rest of your day here at Bible class.